On branch closures, I know issues have been raised with you by New South Wales MP Sophie Kotsis, particularly around the closure of the Earlwood branch. More broadly, we've seen a drop in the number of branches that ANZ has. According to the numbers you supplied to me, you closed some 186 branches from 2015 to 2020, leaving you with 570 branches in 2020. How many branches do you have now?
We have in Australia about 450.
Wow, so that's a big drop, 120 branches.
Yes.
That would mean that your rate of branch closure is the most rapid of all of the majors. That you've closed almost a fifth of your branches just in a year.
Probably. Yes, I imagine that may be the case, yes.
What accounts for such an astonishingly rapid rate of branch closures? Why are you closing branches faster than the others?
To paraphrase, because of the astonishing rapid rate of customer behaviour change. What we've seen, and we've seen it for a number of years now actually, is customers, I don't mean to be dismissive, but I remember one of my colleagues commenting, going to the bank branch was like going to the dentist. You have to do it, but you don't really want to do it. And the reality is now you don't have to. And because we have all these fantastic digital tools, we have home loan specialists who'll come to your house or your place of work and come to where you want to be. And so that convenience has meant, and through all of those tools, we've seen branch traffic fall at an alarming rate. In fact, the number of people, just the sort of foot traffic, if you will, and the average branch has been falling somewhere between 10 and 20% per annum for the last number of years. And what we saw over the last year was it actually accelerated for obvious reasons as people were forced to change their behaviour because of COVID. We had a surprising number of people adopt, for example, the mobile apps and things like that because they needed to, and now they like it. And even though we've opened back branches, and we progressively opened branches, they didn't come back. And we're seeing a similar trend, by the way, Deputy Chair, in ATM usage as people use less and less cash. So it's in response to that changing behaviour where at some point the branches become unsustainable, and so we move on. Now it's interesting to note, during that period of time, we've increased our market share. So more people have actually chosen to bank with ANZ despite the fact that there are less branches available. We track very, very, very closely attrition. So every branch, when we make that difficult, it's a difficult decision to close a branch. We understand the impact on a community. When we make that, we then track what happened to those people who used it. Did they leave us? Did they go down the road? Did they just move digital? And our experiences there is that they largely go online and they prefer that. Or, the days have gone of the idea that people just had a branch they went to. People use a network of branches and they just move their business to another. One final point, and I know I'm speaking a lot, but one final point on that. The majority, many of those branches have actually been metro. And so you sit and say, like in Comyn Street, we don't need 4 branches in Comyn Street, we can probably do with 3. And so it's that sort of consolidation that's really driven a lot of the change that we've seen in our footprint.
I don't think anyone begrudges the closure of the 4th Collins Street branch. The concern is in remote Indigenous communities and for disadvantaged people. In terms of your ATM network, from 2015 to 2020, you closed 430 ATMs, leaving you with 949. I'm quoting another bank's numbers. You closed 511 ATMs, leaving you with 2,105. How many ATMs do you have now?
So I don't have the precise number, but essentially what we do, those ATMs fall into 2 categories. Those that are in an ANZ branch, so there'll be, call it, I don't know, maybe there's 500 odd or something. That's it. Not all branches have them, but they sit there. And those that don't, that might sit in a shopping centre. The ones that don't, you may have read recently we sold that network to Armaguard. So they're currently branded as ANZ, but they are no longer owned by us or in the process of transitioning to Armaguard. They'll be operated by Armaguard, and over the next few years they'll be rebranded into a new brand, so they will no longer be ANZ ATMs. Our customers have access to our ATMs. They have free access to other ATM networks across the country.
Would you take on notice to supply us
Sure.
with the number of ATMs?
Of course, yes.
And have you done work on ATM deserts, places which are no longer served by ATMs, particularly in remote Indigenous communities, for example?
I have not, but I wouldn't be surprised if people on my team have, and again, I'm happy to dig that out if we have such analysis.
I just wanted to ask about branch ATM and staff numbers. You kindly provided some figures to me from our last hearing on branch numbers going back to 2000. From 2015 to 2020, the number of Commonwealth Bank branches fell by 181. Over that same period, the number of ATMs fell by 803, from 3,822 to 3,019. What are the numbers now, and where do you see the trajectory for branches and ATMs in the future?
Well, the number of branches at 31 December 2020 was 938, including both CBA and Bank West. I don't have the numbers that we
So
provide.
you closed another 30 or so.
Yes, I'm happy to come to that. I mean, in terms of, I don't have the numbers that we provided to you in front of me, but the numbers that you mentioned sound correct. What do I believe is the trajectory? I think there'll be reductions in both branch numbers, and clearly we've seen that more recently, and in ATMs. A couple of obvious reasons. One, there's been a significant, I think, structural shift in customer behaviour, not just in banking, but across a number of different sectors. It is, of course, important and will continue to be so to be able to support customers directly on a face-to-face basis. We have the largest branch network. We also, of course, have a relationship with Australia Post, which gives us another 3,500 points of presence to be able to support customers. But clearly we were seeing more customers move their banking interactions either to digital, and particularly during the pandemic that has accelerated, and we haven't seen a return to pre-COVID levels. Similarly, notwithstanding a higher amount of cash that's actually in circulation, there's been quite a substantial reduction in terms of cash used as for payments and over-the-counter transactions, and that's also reflected both in transactions that we see coming into our branch network, as well as the number of interactions that our customers are having with ATMs, which are substantially down over a 10, 5, 3 or 1 year period.
How many ATMs do you have?
I think the number that you mentioned, Dr. Lee, I think, would you say it was 2,700 or so? I think from the 3,500.
No, maybe 3,019 was the number you gave me for 2020. So if it's down to 2,700, that's 300 ATM closures.
Well, perhaps I'll take the question on notice. It's certainly in that order, which is still a substantial fleet of ATMs around the country.
What work do you do to ensure that particularly vulnerable populations aren't left without a branch or without an ATM in the community?
Well, a number of things, and of course that's on an ongoing basis. So, for example, I think you may want to ask about some of the temporary closures of branches during the pandemic. So for the 114 branches that we closed, the vast majority of those were within 5 kilometres of another branch. So that clearly that's one of the considerations. We look at the underlying sort of customer demand in each of those micro markets, and then we try to, alongside either our existing branch network, facilities such as ATMs, but also proximity to the 3,500 Australia Post offices around the country as well.
But do you ever reach out to the customers in a community where you're considering closing the bank and try and find out what share of those people would have difficulty moving online?
Yes, I'm sure we do. Our team in branches, that they spend a lot of time trying to make sure that we're understanding customer preferences and how we'll best support customers, both pre and certainly post various branch closures. I can remember when I was leading the retail bank, where we were putting on, for example, supplementary bus services between one branch to another, which did get very low take up. But we accept there will be, notwithstanding whether the volume of customers that's coming into a particular branch has reduced substantially. We accept that there may be instances where it is inconvenient if a branch of ours is closed, and we will look to and will continue to support customers as best we can, but we recognise that that's not going to be perfect in all instances.
Dr. Lee, one of the measures that we did take in the fairly early stages of the pandemic was recognising that some older customers who had a preference for attending branches in order to withdraw money, we issued them with debit cards so that they didn't have to go to a branch in order to withdraw money. They could use those debit cards, obviously, for example, tap and pay and in shops, but also online if they were able to or wanted to go online.
Would you keep branches open or ATMs going in a loss-making situation in areas such as remote Indigenous communities?
In some instances, we do that today.
And what about staff numbers? How have your staff numbers changed over the last 12 months?
In totality across the organisation?
Yes.
Increased significantly on a 1, 2 and 3 year basis. And some of that, if I just think about the last 12 months and where those branches were temporarily closed, that was a function A of clearly reduced number of customers that were coming into branches, particularly in some of the locations where there was lockdown, but also B, we used those existing staff to assist with our customers, particularly around the deferrals, which Mr. Wilson was asking about, the scale of calls and contacts. We saw an 800% increase in the number of phone calls that we were dealing with during calendar 2020. So we actually had an enormous amount of contact with customers. As an example, just during a repayment deferral period after that first 6 months, we did in the order of 270,000 outbound calls to customers to make sure we understood their needs and circumstances as their repayment deferral was coming to an end. So from our perspective, it was very much around redeployment into some areas, particularly in our operational areas, to support our customers through a variety of different support measures.
Switching to another topic, market concentration. The banking sector is one of the most concentrated sectors of the Australian economy and very highly concentrated compared to other countries. You're the largest of the big four banks. And there's been talk recently that Suncorp might spin off its banking business. If it did, would the Commonwealth Bank look to acquire it?
I don't think it will give you any surprise to hear me say that we're not going to comment on current or future M&A activities, but I guess what I would add is Suncorp is a meaningful contributor, and so we would expect that any move to acquire by a major bank would be reviewed very carefully by the ACCC.
So you'd be open to extending your reach by acquiring smaller players? That doesn't seem a responsible way of ensuring that Australia has a competitive banking market.
Well, Dr. Lee, I think I said I wouldn't comment on current or future M&A. I wouldn't then infer that to mean that we were considering a direct acquisition of anything in particular. But I mean, to your point around, or if you're asking a question about,
you could just rule it out. You could just say we're big enough already.
Well, if you're asking specifically around, let's say, fintech itself is a very broad category. Everything from neobanks that Mr. Wilson was asking me about.
I was going to come to that, but I wanted to ask you about Suncorp first. I mean, I think you could just rule out the Suncorp acquisition.
Yes, but
you're the gorilla in the room. Do you really need to be buying some of the smaller banks?
Well, I think my answer is quite clear. We're not going to comment on M&A activity, and they're a meaningful player, and I'm sure that the ACCC would closely scrutinise any acquisition. I'll allow you to draw your own conclusions from that comment.
We're going to go to fintechs there. One of the concerns that market watchers have raised is that some of the larger banks are making fintech acquisitions not in order to grow in that space, but in order to quash potential competitors. Can you rule out the Commonwealth Bank taking those sorts of actions?
Well, again, fintech itself is a very broad category. There's a number of, you'd say, technology providers who are deliberately trying to build capability without an ability to scale or with a viable business model, but may accelerate innovation if it was scaled. And so I wouldn't rule out an acquisition of that nature. I mean, fundamentally, a number of fintechs rely on being acquired by a player, and I think any suggestion that they were unable to be acquired by a financial institution would hamper their ability to raise capital on both an upfront and an ongoing basis.
So you would be open to acquiring a fintech in order to quash competition?
Dr. Lee, again, that's not what I said. I said we might be open to acquiring technology if we thought that it was truly innovative, it was going to augment our capability and offering, it was going to bring innovation and competition to the market. I'm not aware of any instances or that we've been looking at anything that would fall into the former category that you spoke of.
But it's clearly something which would raise profits of Australia's largest bank to have a potential competitor out of the way. What I'm asking for you to do is to rule out on principle that kind of acquisition, an acquisition motivated by taking down a potential threat rather than by growing profits.
But I mean, at a principal level, that's clearly an issue for the ACCC. That's specifically what their remit and what they'd be looking at. I mean, we will do well as an organisation if we serve our customers well today and into the future. A big part of our strategy is digital and technology. We certainly are and intend to continue to innovate. Much of that we will do organically internally, but there may be opportunities where it's advantageous for us and for the company and with no impact on competition at a market level at all, but there may be offerings that we can look to enhance for our existing customer base. That I think is good for the broader market, and you'll see further innovation and continued improvements to products and services across the industry.
You supplied, in answer to a question I had on notice, branch numbers going back to 2000 to the year 2000. From 2015 to 2020, NAB closed 106 banks and 430 ATMs. What are your current numbers of branches and ATMs?
Let me just get hold of those.
I think you meant
numbers.
branches. They didn't close 134 banks, did they?
Quite right, Mr. Valensky. Thank you.
No, happy to give you the latest stats on that because we've got them updated now to the end of March. And we have 596 branches. So from 2018 it was 657. We're now down at, still at 596 branches.
So that's about 40 closures over the course of the year. And
It's about 60 closures over the last 3 years.
And do you have a number of temporary closures which could become permanent?
We had 80 branches that were temporary closed through COVID. We have reopened 78 of those branches.
And ATM numbers?
ATM numbers were reasonably low in our ATMs. Let me just find the stats on those.
I had 949 from 2020.
We're still around the 800 to 900, late 800s. I'll try and find those stats for you.
At the end of February, we had 899 ATMs.
899. So over the year, you've closed 50 ATMs.
About 52.
And what is the impact on small businesses of having their nearest branch close?
Well, look, a lot of businesses today, as we know, are using electronic forms to do their banking. We also have more business bankers out in the marketplace than we've had probably 2 years ago. We have them out with our business customers. Their forms of using cash are dropping quite dramatically. We've seen that in our own cash numbers and our own cheque numbers down dramatically as they're using more forms of electronic activity.
But surely you wouldn't think that there's no impact. I mean, you could immediately think of a few impacts on small businesses. Firstly, they would have to carry cash further, and so there'd be more obligation on the small business to do cash handling themselves or to use a cash handling service. Secondly, they might find it more difficult to speak to a local NAB banker who understands their local circumstances.
First off, can we have a look at the cash utilisation has been dropping considerably. So to say that they carry more cash is probably not correct. They're actually probably carrying less cash because less cash is going through their accounts. They're using other forms of cashless transaction.
But let me be clear, if there's a branch a kilometre away and you close it and the next one is 10 kilometres away, I have to carry the cash further.
Absolutely. But also you look at that, the chances of them actually going that 20 kilometres or 50 kilometres away to do their other activities is about 80% of people actually use a branch further away than the one that's close to them as well. So the utilisation of a series of branches is much more than it used to be because they're going into larger centres to do their shopping and the likes. But I think we do have to look realistically at what's happening with cash in the Australian marketplace. It is dropping off. We're not becoming cashless, but we are coming less cash. And the other thing is that we've done as connected with Australian Post, and Australian Post takes cash in and out and checks in and out on our behalf. So there's 3,500 places that small businesses and individuals can get to.
Do you do any surveys of small businesses to gauge the effect on them when you close their nearest bank?
Yes, we do. And we also then flow through and look at what is the impact of their utilisation, both pre-closing and after closing as well.
And what
the
have you
vast
found?
majority are using another branch as well as that one as part of their weekly, monthly routines.
What do you expect will be the trajectory for branches and ATMs over the next decade?
I think it will continue to decline based around customer utilisation and the uptick in digitisation. And we've seen that even more so through COVID, when we make an assumption that the elderly people can't use digital means. It's just not the case. We've had a 94-year-old start using a mobile device. We've had a 104-year-old using a debit card for the first time in their lives. So I think people are changing the way they operate because the world is changing. I can remember 40 years ago, I used to have milk and bread delivered to the doorstep of our house. I can remember at university working for a service station where I'd go out and I'd pump the petrol, check the oil, do the tyres, wipe the windscreen. Well, it's changed, and people in those cases, most of the time they don't want the bonnet lift up, nor does the manufacturer, and customers are quite happy to pay for petrol that's cheaper when they do it all themselves. And I think that's effectively what's happening across banking. They are seeing other ways of doing it, and we are putting in place more people to actually deal with customers, particularly in rural communities and in the small business. They're able to use a digital activity. They're actually able to phone in and video conference in now. 25% of our branch-related mortgages are now done through a video call, where customers don't have to come into the branch. They can actually video in and have their mortgage sorted out. So I think the world is changing, and we need to be very cognizant of those who need a branch, and when we close, we close with that in mind, or keep it open with that in mind.
No one thinks it's an issue if people are able to easily go online, but I'm looking at in one of your internal documents for customer advisors who are looking to, quote, manage resistance to digital banking. It says that staff should be prepared for customers who don't want to move to digital banking on the grounds that I don't want you to lose your job. I don't trust internet banking. Your ATMs are always out of service. Do you think it's reasonable that your staff are being asked to effectively move someone onto digital banking where that customer wants to stay doing in-person banking because they don't want your staff members to risk losing their jobs?
Well, first off, I think it is very realistic and reasonable that we ask our colleagues to help customers with different ways that they can do their banking that will actually make it easier for them. And of course there is resistance to any change, and banking changes, you find resistance to them. And some of those things are, well, I don't want you to lose your job. Well, the interesting fact is, as we have closed down the number of branches just recently, none of the colleagues have lost their jobs. We've put them into jobs in their local community that they can do from home or the back of a different branch. So I think it's being realistic with customers and putting, what they can do and what does happen to them to take those objections away. And many of those objections are around, I've always done it this way. Well, as I said, we used to have milk and bread delivered to our house. It doesn't happen anymore. We go to a supermarket to do that. So I'm just saying that we are training our people to handle those objections, as I think is quite reasonable for us to do. But also to show people how they can more easily do their banking using some of the tools that are available today.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr King, for appearing today. I wanted to start with the question of branch closures and ATM closures. If I look at the numbers that you supplied me with last time around, from 2015 to 2020, Westpac's number of branches fell from 1,103 to 918, a loss of 185 branches, and your ATMs fell from 3,073 to 1,429, a loss of 1,644 ATMs, although I accept that 700 of those are the Westpac Pressager sales. How many branches and ATMs have you closed over the last year? What is your current number of branches and ATMs?
So we've got 879 branches, so that's down about 40, I think. And then in terms of ATMs, we still include Pressager because they're Westpac branded ATMs. We've got 2,088.
So how many ATMs have you closed in that period then?
It'd be in the order of 45.
Most of those ATM closures have been associated with branch closures, Dr. Lee.
And the temporary branch closures, how many of them, how many branches are temporarily closed? And of those, how many do you expect will be permanently closed?
At the peak, we had around 80 from memory were temporarily closed, and I believe 50 of those have been reopened.
Do you do any special modelling to ensure that vulnerable communities aren't hurt by branch and ATM closures?
When we look at the regional areas, we think about our overall capability, so our digital capability as well as our call centre capability. We think about our Australia Post relationship because there's 3,500 points of presence under that relationship. We think about other things that we can do. So during COVID, for many passbook holders, we also provided debit cards, which helped people when a lot of the branches were closed. And then for specialist teams such as Indigenous, we have a specific Indigenous call centre in Adelaide, which deals with some of the specific needs of those industries. So we think about the service that we provide as well as the branch footprint.
Of the branch and ATM closures you've mentioned, how many are in predominantly Indigenous communities?
I don't think many would be, but I don't know specifically. But that's the call centre that we have down in Adelaide has a number of people in it who can speak the different dialects of Aboriginal people, and so that's a way that we've found is a good way to help the remote communities.
Westpac has a walkout working performance and reward framework. To what extent is that aimed at incentivising branches to stop their customers using branches? Put another way, to what extent is walkout working aiming to ask branches to make themselves redundant?
Well, I think it's actually turned it around. It's a customers would expect that if you can go into the branch and open up an account that you walk out and the account's working. So that's the name of that program is actually to meet the customer need. So when you open up an account, we want them to walk out of the branch and it's working. Increasingly what we're seeing is around 40% of those type of transactions are being done digitally now, so we're getting less coming into the branches and more being done online. And as I look at the future trends, I think that'll be increasingly more the case that people will open up their their banking facilities online because there's more ability to identify people digitally. Working with some of the new fintech providers, they certainly provide different capabilities for us in the way that we open up and identify people.
So you don't think that the passage in walkout working, which encourages branches to get customers to use smart ATMs, kiosks and become digitally active, you don't think that's going to accelerate the rate of branch closures?
Oh, I think the overall trend of digitisation in the economy is actually increasing. If I look at government services, more and more of those are going online. If I look at financial services, we're moving our business online. We're competing with new business models that are digitally only. And then you've got other sectors of the economy also moving to digital. So I think the trend is more digital, and the challenge for industry is how do we help people move into the digital economy?